Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive? Today we are looking into something that might surprise you. We are talking about the connection between how our brains process visual information.
Right.
It's schizophrenia. Yeah, schizophrenia. You guys sent in some seriously fascinating research about contrast sensitivity, which is basically your ability to tell the difference between subtle differences in light and dark. And you know what? Scientists are finding that people with schizophrenia often have a harder time with this than people who don't. So the big question is, why? And could this be like a game changer for how we diagnose and understand this incredibly complex disorder? So we will be looking at a news piece today from Neuroscience News, which summarizes a pretty massive study published in Schizophrenia Bulletin. And get this, they actually analyzed over 600 other studies for this one. Before we get into the heavy stuff, let's talk about contrast sensitivity for a second. You know, it's not just about seeing black and white. Think about I'm trying to make out someone's face in a super dimly lit room, or trying to read text that's really faded. That's your contrast sensitivity, hard at work. It's way more important than you might think. This ability helps us navigate this crazy world full of visual information, right? Picking out shapes, textures, all the little details that make up our perception of reality. Now, consider this. Schizophrenia affects something like 1% of the world's population. That is millions of people. And what researchers are finding is that a lot of individuals with schizophrenia consistently show reduced contrast sensitivity.
It really is interesting, right? I mean, we kind of think of vision as this straightforward thing, but it's really a super complex process happening in the brain. And when that process gets disrupted, as it seems to be in schizophrenia, it can totally have a ripple effect on someone's entire experience of the world.
Absolutely. It's not just seeing things differently. It's about how your brain is interpreting, making sense of all that visual information it's receiving. So one of the things the study looks at is this potential link between reduced contrast sensitivity and a neurotransmitter called glutamate. Now, I think most people have heard of neurotransmitters, but they are like the unsung heroes of our brains.
Yes. They're the messengers that allow different parts of our brain to communicate with each other. And glutamate is really important for them. All kinds of brain functions like learning, memory, sensory perception.
Exactly. So when it comes to contrast sensitivity, researchers think that reduced glutamate levels might lead to lower activity in the brain areas that are responsible for processing visual contrast. It's like this chain reaction. And we are just now starting to untangle all the links.
And, to add even more complexity here, glutamate doesn't just act in one uniform way. There are different types of glutamate receptors. You can kind of think of them like specialized docking stations in the brain. And each receptor subtype plays a slightly different role. Some might be more involved in contrast sensitivity than others. And that's something scientists are still figuring out.
It's so cool how something we consider basic, like our vision, is tied to all these crazy complex networks in our brains. Okay, so let's connect this back to schizophrenia for a second. If reduced contrast sensitivity is linked to glutamate dysfunction, could this lead to new, more targeted therapies?
Well, it's definitely a promising avenue to explore. Imagine being able to tailor treatments based on an individual specific neurochemical profile. It's personalized medicine.
For your mental health.
That's amazing.
That could potentially change how we approach schizophrenia treatment. But of course, there's still so much we're learning.
Right. And it is important to remember that this research is exciting, but it's still early. We need more studies to confirm these findings and to really tease out the complexities of how all these factors interact.
For example, the researchers point out that we need to figure out how antipsychotic medications, which are commonly used to treat schizophrenia, might affect contrast sensitivity. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation. Do the medications cause the changes, or is it the underlying condition itself? And then there's the whole issue of attentional lapses, which are pretty common in schizophrenia. How do we know those aren't part of the problem? How do we separate those from actual problems with contrast processing?
Exactly. Untangling all of those threads is going to be key moving forward.
Okay, this is where it gets really cool. The article even brings up the possibility of contrast sensitivity tests becoming a tool for early diagnosis of schizophrenia. Just imagine a simple vision test, maybe even given at schools or as part of a normal checkup. That could flag potential issues early on. That would be huge.
It would. The possibility of having an objective, non-invasive way to detect risk factors for schizophrenia is definitely appealing. But as with any potential biomarker, we need to proceed carefully. It's crucial to make sure that these tests are accurate and reliable. We have to make sure that they can differentiate between schizophrenia and other conditions that might also affect contrast perception. False positives or negatives could have really serious consequences.
You're so right. We don't want to jump the gun. But the potential here is really big. Okay, so we have covered a lot today. We have talked about contrast sensitivity, its potential link to glutamate dysfunction and schizophrenia, the possibility of personalized treatments based on this new understanding, and even the potential for early diagnosis through simple vision tests. But what does all this mean for you, the listener? Why should you care? Well, this research is offering us a new lens through which to view and understand schizophrenia. It's highlighting the crazy connections between our brains, our senses, and our mental health. And it's opening up exciting possibilities for more targeted treatments and earlier interventions that could potentially improve the lives of millions. And that is something worth paying attention to. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's take a deeper dive in some of the specific implications of this research after a quick break.
It's amazing, isn't it, how this research is like challenging our assumptions about mental illness. You know, we tend to think of schizophrenia in terms of like thought disorders and hallucinations. But this sheds light on how big of an impact it can have on sensory perception, too.
It's like a good reminder that the brain is this crazy complex organ. And when something goes wrong in one area, it can have like these cascading effects throughout the whole system. It really shows us that we need a holistic approach to understanding and treating mental health conditions. And
thinking about the sensory aspect, this research got me thinking about those visual training programs that they mentioned in the article. Could those actually help people with schizophrenia, like to improve their contrast sensitivity?
It's a really interesting possibility, and it makes sense if you think about how adaptable the brain is. Even in adulthood, we know that with practice, people can improve their visual skills. Like, think about athletes training their eye-hand coordination, or like musicians learning to read sheet music. So if we can develop these training programs to like address contrast sensitivity deficits, could that actually lead to tangible improvements in daily functioning?
That's what we hope. And it wouldn't just be about improving visual perception. Researchers think that strengthening contrast sensitivity could also help with other cognitive functions like attention, memory, even social cognition.
That's incredible. Imagine if something as simple as visual training could have such a big impact on someone's quality of life.
Of course. With any new therapy, we need to do the research to determine if it is effective. But the potential is there, and it points to a broader shift in mental health treatment, moving beyond managing symptoms to actually targeting the underlying neurological mechanism.
Right. It's like instead of putting a Band-Aid on the problem, we're trying to address the root cause. And speaking of getting to the root of things, the article also mentions how this research can help us better understand subtypes of schizophrenia. Can you talk about that a little more?
Sure. So traditionally, we've diagnosed schizophrenia based on a cluster of symptoms, but we know that there's a lot of variability in how the illness presents. Not everyone experiences the same symptoms or with the same severity. And this research suggests that there might be subgroups within the schizophrenia spectrum characterized by different levels of contrast sensitivity impairment.
So some people with schizophrenia
Yeah.
might have more contrast sensitivity issues than others.
Yeah.
And that could affect their overall experience with the illness.
Exactly. And if we can identify these subgroups early, it could help us personalize treatment plans.
It's all connecting now. If we understand the neurological stuff
Yeah.
of an individual's schizophrenia, we can tailor therapies, medications, maybe even those visual training programs to their unique needs.
Yeah.
But as you mentioned before, we are still early in this research. We need more studies to validate these findings and explore all the possibilities.
Absolutely. But this research has opened up such a fascinating new path. It's like we stumbled upon this hidden pathway in the brain, and we're just beginning to figure out where it goes.
It's like that saying, we see only what we know. It seems like the more we learn about the brain, the more we realize how much we still don't know.
That's the great thing about science. It's a never-ending process of discovery, refinement, and pushing the boundaries of what we understand.
And this discovery, this link between visual contrast and schizophrenia, it feels like it's challenging us to look beyond the surface, to think about the ways our senses shape our reality.
And to appreciate the incredible diversity of human experience, even with mental illness.
It's pretty profound when you think about it that way. But before we get too philosophical, let's talk about the practical stuff again. One of the most exciting parts of this research is the potential for early diagnosis, right? Being able to identify people who might be at risk for schizophrenia before the illness fully shows up.
Right. Early intervention is so important in mental health. The earlier we can find issues and provide support, the better the chances are of improving long-term outcomes.
So if those contrast sensitivity tests turn out to be reliable, we could maybe add them to routine screenings, maybe even in schools or during regular checkups.
It's a good idea. But we have to think about the ethics. We need to make sure these tests are used responsibly and don't lead to stigma or discrimination.
You're right. We need to balance early detection with respecting individual rights and privacy. It's a tough but really important conversation to have. Okay, so as we wrap up this part, I think it's obvious that this research is a big deal.
It's giving us a new perspective on schizophrenia, showing us the connection between our senses, our brains, and our mental well-being.
And it's making us ask new questions about personalized treatments, early diagnoses, and even the nature of consciousness. But let's save those big thoughts for our last segment. We will be right back to wrap things up and leave you with some final thoughts. All right, we're back and ready to kind of wrap up our look at this fascinating connection between visual contrast sensitivity and schizophrenia. You know, as we've been talking, I keep thinking about this whole idea of perception, how our brains take in information from our senses and use that to create our own reality.
It's a big question, yeah. How much of what we experience is because of our biology, our genetics, like our unique wiring, and how much is influenced by the environment around us, our experiences, how we interpret things.
And with schizophrenia, it seems like maybe those lines are even more blurry.
Yeah. If people with schizophrenia are processing visual information differently, it makes sense that their perception of the world might also be different.
And that could explain some of the symptoms we see with schizophrenia, like hallucinations or delusions.
It's definitely something to think about. Imagine if you were trying to live in a world where all the visual cues you're getting don't quite match up with what everyone else is seeing. It would be really disorienting.
It makes you think about, like, what consciousness really is.
Yeah.
And what it means to share a reality with other people. But, okay. Besides all the philosophy, this research also matters for how we think about treatment.
For sure. As we have been talking about, the potential for personalized medicine is huge. Imagine being able to find specific neurological things like contrast sensitivity problems, and then being able to create a treatment plan just for that.
Yeah. It's like, instead of just trying a bunch of random treatments and hoping one works, we're going right to the source of the problem.
Exactly. And that could mean more effective treatments, less side effects, and overall a better quality of life for people with schizophrenia.
It's pretty amazing when you think about how far we've come with neuroscience and mental health research.
It's a good time to be in this field. There is still a lot we don't know, but with every new discovery, we're getting closer to understanding the brain and finding new ways to help people.
Well said. And I think one of the most important things we've learned today is that we need to stay curious, keep asking questions, and not be afraid to rethink what we thought we knew. Sometimes the most interesting things come from unexpected places, like this connection between visual contrast and schizophrenia. So, to everyone listening, keep thinking, keep asking those questions, and never stop exploring all the amazing complexities of being human.
And remember, science is a journey. There's always more to learn, more to discover, and more to understand.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of visual contrast and schizophrenia. Until next time, stay curious.